Sullivan, maybe stick to bedpans instead of critical thinking. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 48 hours before a two-star general had him perp walked out of Seattle General in San Diego. He had no idea who was standing beside the vending machine. He had no idea what her hands had held. The ER smells of antiseptic and burnt coffee under buzzing fluorescent lights that sound like insects, the same frequency as the ones that died in Baghdad heat. Brooke Sullivan moves through night shift with clinical precision, her movements efficient and forgettable, the kind of invisible that takes years to perfect. She wears long sleeves that cover rope-burn scars on her forearms, thin white lines like wind-carved rock. Her badge clips to her pocket with the name B. Sullivan, RN, in letters small enough that most people don't read them. Most people don't read her at all. At the supply station, she triple-checks inventory logs with a pen that moves like a surgical instrument, deliberate, exact, leaving nothing to chance. 12 intubation kits sit in the order Dr. Whitfield submitted yesterday. 12. For an ER that runs maybe 3 intubations a month. She pulls up the last 6 months of orders on the computer. The pattern emerges like a fingerprint. Equipment ordered but never used. Supplies billed to insurance but never opened. The numbers add up to something that makes her jaw tighten, but only for a second, only when nobody is looking. Dr. Whitfield watches from the nurse's station with narrowed eyes. He is 46, built like a man who lifts weights to stay angry, with a watch that costs more than most people's cars, a Rolex Submariner, platinum, the kind of thing that announces itself in every room. His hair is graying at the temples in a way he probably finds distinguished. His voice sounds like a tank idling in a garage, low, heavy, capable of crushing things. When he sees Brooke questioning the intubation order, his jaw tightens with barely concealed rage. She doesn't know she has just cost him $47,000 in phantom billing this month. She doesn't know that she has become a problem. He approaches the supply station with the casual confidence of a man who has never met resistance he couldn't overcome. Sullivan. Question about the order. The intubation kits, Dr. Whitfield. We haven't used more than 4 in any month. 12 seems excessive. His smile is the smile of a wolf showing its teeth. I appreciate the input. But I make purchasing decisions here. You make sure the supplies arrive. The last order sat unopened for 8 weeks. Sometimes we stockpile. Sometimes we anticipate patient volume. Sometimes it's not your concern. He walks away before she can respond. That is his strategy, he doesn't wait for answers. He speaks and leaves, and the architecture of the hospital is built to make him right. Chief of Emergency Medicine. Board member. The kind of surgeon who gets his name on things. The kind of man who is used to being the smartest person in every room and has stopped checking whether that is actually true. Brooke returns to her charts. She doesn't flush. She doesn't clench her fists visibly. Her hands hold the pen with the same steady pressure they held the reins of a Humvee speeding through Fallujah streets 18 years ago. The trembling, if it happens at all, happens in the basement laundry room at 3 in the morning when she is alone under lights that sound exactly like Baghdad. Thursday morning, 6:16 a.m., the staff vending machine sits against the wall near the break room where nobody important goes. Brooke is getting black coffee when Dr. Whitfield appears beside her like he has been waiting for this exact moment. Maybe he has. Maybe he has learned that she takes her break at the same time every shift, a predictability that comes from someone who lives by timers and protocols, someone who learned a long time ago that deviations get people killed. Sullivan. He is holding a bottle of expensive water, the kind with a name that sounds like a luxury resort. I hear you've been asking questions about my orders. Just verifying inventory, Dr. Whitfield. Right. Verifying. That's a generous way to describe sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. He takes a sip of water with the kind of deliberate casualness that is designed to make her feel small. You know what I think? I think a nurse who has been here less than a year should focus on nursing. Not forensic accounting. Not detective work. Just bedpans and catheters. That's the job. That's the level. 3 interns are sitting in the break room, visible through the window, their heads turning slightly at the sound of his voice. They are listening. He knows they are listening. This is not a conversation. This is a performance. This is him establishing hierarchy in front of an audience. Sullivan, maybe stick to bedpans instead of critical thinking. You're good at the first part. The second part? Out of your depth. One of the interns looks down at his coffee. Another almost smiles. The third, a woman with dark hair and tired eyes, doesn't move, doesn't react, she just watches. The silence tastes like copper. Brooke's knuckles whiten around the coffee cup. For exactly 2 seconds, something surfaces behind her eyes, not rage, not humiliation, but the kind of controlled fury that comes from someone who has learned that showing anger is the fastest way to lose wars. Then she breathes. Then it passes. Her face is a mask again, the kind of mask that took years to build, the kind that kept her alive in places where emotion was a liability. She turns back to her coffee without saying a word. She walks out of the break room without looking at any of them. She leaves Dr. Whitfield standing there with his expensive water, his expensive watch, his expensive opinion, and the minor irritation of someone who just threw a punch and hit air. He had expected tears. He had expected an apology. He had expected her to shrink. She had done none of those things. And that would make him worse. Room 12 is in the back corridor, away from the main chaos of the ER. The patient is a Special Forces paratrooper named Jake Reeves, admitted last night after a training accident, a miscalculation on a routine jump that sent him into the side of a Humvee at the Naval Amphibious Base in Coronado. He has a fractured collarbone, some deep muscle bruising, and the kind of post-op fatigue that comes from anesthesia and pain medication. 26 years old, lean like a man who runs toward danger instead of away from it, with eyes the color of the Atlantic on an overcast day. His left arm is in a sling. His forearm, visible below the sling, carries fresh tattoo ink, still healing, still red at the edges. Brooke enters room 12 at 7:15 a.m. with a blood pressure cuff and a thermometer. She moves with clinical efficiency, her movements practiced and professional, the kind of invisible care that keeps people alive but nobody remembers. She approaches his left side to check his vitals. That is when she sees it. The tattoo. Her name. Brooke Sullivan. In careful script. In healing ink. On the forearm of a man whose face she knows but whose eyes don't recognize her. She doesn't freeze. She doesn't miss a beat. Her hands move to the blood pressure cuff with the same mechanical precision they used every other morning for every other patient. Systolic 128. Diastolic 82. Normal. Good. He doesn't need a medication adjustment. He is healing. Good morning, Lieutenant. Her voice is steady, professional, empty of anything but courtesy. Morning. Just Jake is fine. He smiles politely at the stranger taking his vitals, the kind of smile you give someone whose job is to help you but whose name you will never remember. How are things out there? Quiet shift. You're doing well. Pain level. 4. Down from a 7 yesterday. I'll note that. Dr. Whitfield will probably clear you for physical therapy by this afternoon. Jake nods. He shifts slightly in the bed, wincing at the movement, reaching for the water pitcher with his right hand. She hands it to him without being asked. He thanks her without looking at her face. He has no idea that the woman standing beside his bed carried him for miles through the streets of Fallujah with a 7.62 round lodged in her shoulder, calling in airstrikes on a satellite phone while his blood soaked through her uniform. He has no idea that she held his body weight while bullets kicked up concrete dust around them like they were dancing in hell. He has no idea that his name is the first name she whispers at 3 a.m. when the Baghdad sounds in the fluorescent lights get too loud. He has no idea because the operation is erased. Because classified means erased. Because she disappeared from every database, from every record, from every official history, traded her commission for a new name, a new life, a new existence in the margins of the world where her own government pretended she had never existed. And that was the deal. That was the cost of coming home alive. She marks his vitals in his chart. Temperature 98.6. Heart rate 71. Blood pressure 128/82. The sling is secure. The surgical site looks clean. He is healing on a normal trajectory. Everything by the numbers. Everything correct. Her face doesn't flicker. Her hands don't tremble. She is a nurse checking on a patient. She is invisible. She is exactly what she has trained herself to be. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that the man lying in that bed was only alive because of the person standing beside him, and that person was supposed to be a ghost. The worst part was knowing that somewhere in his morphine-hazed memories, there might be fragments of her, the sound of her voice calling for support, the pressure of her hands holding him together, the certainty in her face that they were going to make it out of there, and that he would never be able to reach those memories, never be able to confirm that they were real or just fever dreams from trauma. The worst part was that she couldn't tell him. The worst part was that she wasn't supposed to exist. She closed his chart and left the room. In 2 hours, her shift would end. In 2 hours, she would go back to her apartment that nobody visited, to her life that had no history before San Diego, to her routine that was designed to leave no fingerprints on the world. And she would touch the pair of worn combat boots in her locker, the ones caked with dried sand and blood from a street that had been erased from every map, and she would remember who she had been, and who she could never be again. The hospital would continue its rhythms. Dr. Whitfield would continue his schemes. Jake Reeves would continue his recovery. And Brooke Sullivan would continue her invisibility, the way she had been trained to do, the way she had been ordered to do, the way she had done for 18 years without complaint. She had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. Thursday morning arrived with the smell of industrial coffee and the distant rhythm of a trauma alert that had already come and gone. The Grand Rounds conference room at Seattle General filled methodically, 30 residents in white coats, 5 attending physicians in navy blue, the institutional weight of hierarchy arranged in descending rows of chairs. The fluorescent lights cast that particular surgical white that made everyone look slightly anemic, and the air conditioning hummed with the sterile indifference of a room designed for judgment. Dr. Whitfield stood at the podium with his tablet glowing like a weapon he'd already decided how to use. His fingers moved across the screen with the casual precision of a man who'd never once questioned his own authority, and when he looked up, his eyes found Brooke standing at the front corner of the room where he'd positioned her 15 minutes earlier. Not sitting. Standing. Where everyone could see her. "Let's examine Nurse Sullivan's charting from Tuesday as a teaching example," he said, his voice carrying the theatrical weight of someone performing for an audience. A case study in outdated triage protocols. The projector hummed to life. Her documentation appeared on the screen behind her, her handwriting, her assessment notes, her decision tree for that paratrooper in room 12. Brooke could feel 30 pairs of eyes shift from the screen to her back, then back to the screen again. Nurse Sullivan assessed this post-operative patient and noted what she characterized as muffled heart sounds with mild tachycardia. Whitfield continued, his inflection making quotation marks in the air like they were the ravings of someone deeply unqualified. Classic field medicine thinking. Dangerously obsolete. In a modern acute care setting, we recognize that post-surgical anxiety manifests with identical vital sign presentations, and premature intervention based on these vague findings creates unnecessary patient alarm and redundant testing. He clicked to the next slide, her O2 saturation notation, her repeated vitals check at 2-hour intervals, her notation about distended neck veins. See how the pattern escalates. Each assessment feeds the previous one. This is confirmation bias dressed up as clinical vigilance. This is a nurse, however well-intentioned, practicing medicine without appropriate supervision or education. He turned slightly, not quite looking at her. This is what happens when someone confuses pattern recognition with expertise. One of the residents, a thin woman in the third row, wrote something in her notebook. Then another resident did. Then another. The scratching of pens on paper was the only sound besides the air conditioning and Whitfield's measured breathing. Brooke's hands were clasped in front of her. Her spine was straight. Her face was a mask, the kind of perfect stillness that comes not from peace but from the precise calibration of every micro-expression, every muscle fiber held in exact position the way she'd been trained to hold position in a hide sight for 18 hours without moving, without blinking, without allowing a single involuntary twitch to give away her location. Notice also the redundancy in her assessment methodology, Whitfield said, clicking through 3 more of her charting entries. She checked this patient's pressure manually twice when the machine was functioning perfectly. She auscultated the heart sounds 3 separate times. This is reminiscent of field medicine from a different era, when practitioners didn't have access to reliable monitoring equipment and had to rely on repetitive physical examination to compensate for technological limitations. He paused. The silence stretched. That era ended, Nurse Sullivan. Medicine evolved. Some practitioners evolved with it. The implication hung in the room like anesthetic gas. Brooke's jaw tightened, a single muscular contraction at the hinge, barely visible, lasting less than a second. Then it released. Her expression remained exactly as it had been. In conclusion, Whitfield said, turning back to the residents, when you encounter a nurse with this assessment pattern in your future practice, I'd recommend politely suggesting she consult with a physician before initiating any interventions that might compromise patient comfort or waste hospital resources. Questions. There were no questions. The residents kept their eyes forward. One of them, a young man in the front row who looked like he'd never questioned an authority figure in his life, seemed to be holding his breath. Whitfield nodded at Brooke with a kind of smile that wasn't quite a smile. You can go back to your unit now, Nurse Sullivan. Thank you for the teaching example. She turned and walked out of the conference room with the same measured pace she'd walked in, her shoes making small clicking sounds on the tile floor that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. None of the residents looked at her as she passed. That was the real lesson Whitfield had taught them, that it was safe to ignore her, that her presence didn't matter, that she was a cautionary tale wearing scrubs instead of a cautionary tale wearing a uniform. The 4th floor hallway was dim compared to the conference room, and the vending machine at the far end hummed its small mechanical song. Brooke had intended to get water. That was all. A bottle of water and back to the medication dispensary where she needed to verify the inventory logs before the supply order at noon. She didn't see Dr. Whitfield until he was already there, blocking the machine's front with his body, 2 interns flanking him like remoras following a larger fish. Sullivan, he said, not turning around yet, making a show of inserting coins into the machine's slot. Perfect timing. I was just telling these gentlemen about your assessment philosophy. She waited, one hand reaching for the machine's handle. Maybe stick to bedpans instead of critical thinking, he said, pulling out a bottled water and turning to face her fully. His voice was loud enough that it carried down the hallway, casual enough that it sounded like genuine advice rather than public mockery. You'd probably be more comfortable in that lane. No shame in knowing your limitations. The interns made small sounds, one of them disguised it as a cough, but the other didn't bother hiding it. Coffee cups came up. Shoulders moved slightly in that specific way that meant laughter being swallowed. Brooke's knuckles whitened around the water bottle she'd just taken from the machine. The plastic crinkled, a small, audible crunch that seemed to echo off the linoleum. Her breath came in and out with perfect control. 1 second. 2 seconds. Her jaw worked once, hard, the muscles at her temples visible for just a moment before she released it. Then she turned. Without a word. Without looking back. Her footsteps carried her back down the hallway toward her station, her posture unchanged, her pace unchanged, the water bottle held in one perfectly steady hand. Behind her, Whitfield was already talking to the interns about something else, his attention moving on like a shark that had already fed and was looking for the next opportunity to feed again. The afternoon brought her back to the medication dispensary, where she needed to account for every morphine tablet, every fentanyl patch, every controlled substance that moved through her unit. The inventory sheet lay on the counter, pale yellow paper with the hospital's logo printed in the corner, columns for date and time and supply category and quantity and signature. Dr. Whitfield found her there at 2:15 p.m., counting pills the way she'd been trained to count ammunition 64 years ago, her hands moving with the precision of someone for whom exactitude wasn't a preference but a survival mechanism. Your kind of nursing went out with leeches, sweetheart, he said, leaning against the counter so that she couldn't complete her count without maneuvering around him. Adapt or leave. Those are really your only options. She didn't look up. Continued counting. 19, 20, 21. You understand what I'm saying, he pressed. 22. 23. I'd hate to see you terminated for cause instead of just moving on. But if you keep questioning the way I order supplies, keep second-guessing physician directives, keep acting like you know more than the doctors in this hospital, that's the direction this goes. He smiled, thin and sharp and without a single ounce of warmth. Your next evaluation is in 60 days. I'd recommend spending those 60 days proving that you understand the hierarchy around here. Brooke's jaw clenched once, hard, the kind of single muscular contraction that looked almost like an involuntary twitch but was actually the complete opposite. It was the release valve for something she was holding so tightly that even that one small movement represented a calibrated overflow. She continued counting. Signed the sheet with a pen in her right hand, her signature steady and precise despite the pressure coiling through every muscle in her body. He walked away. She finished the count in silence, listening to his footsteps fade back toward the elevators and then toward his office 2 floors down, where he would spend the next hour systematically altering the supply requisition files on his computer. Where he would make adjustments to equipment orders that he'd inflated by 40%. Where he would cross-reference the timestamps of his alterations with when the night shift took inventory, making sure there was a time lag that would make it look like the discrepancies existed before he'd made any changes. He was good at what he did, not the medicine, but the other thing. The institutional sabotage. The paper trail manipulation. The strategic positioning of people in places where they would either conform or fail. He had no idea what was about to happen at 2:11 a.m. the next morning, in a room he'd never personally entered, with a patient whose name would eventually be connected to his own in ways that would obliterate everything he'd spent years building. But that was tomorrow. Tonight was just the weight of silence and the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like insects, like the insects that had lived in the rubble of Baghdad, like the sound Brooke had learned to sleep through 18 years ago when she stopped being anyone's daughter and started being something else entirely. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone above the night ward, and Brooke moved through it like a ghost who had learned to cast a shadow. Room 12 held the paratrooper, Jake Reeves, 26, recovering smoothly from his training accident until 2:51 a.m. Friday when his eyes snapped open and he began to sweat through his hospital gown. His chest was tight. His breathing shallow. The night resident, a thin man named Chen who'd been awake for 32 hours, glanced at the monitor showing normal sinus rhythm and prescribed anxiety. Post-operative stress response, he said without entering the room. Happens all the time. I'll order it even. But anxiety doesn't make your jugular veins distend. Anxiety doesn't push your trachea 3 millimeters to the left. Brooke stood in the doorway with her pen still in her hand and watched Jake's oxygen saturation tick downward, 98, 96, 93, and something in her chest went cold and precise, the way it always did when the world was about to break open. She stepped to his bedside and her fingers found his pulse, rapid, thread-like, already failing. His skin was grey. His lips had started to purple at the edges. She lifted his shirt and looked at the surgical site, no bleeding from the incision, then placed her hands on his ribs and felt them, the dullness of fluid where there should have been air, the way his left side sounded like a drum filled with water instead of sound. "Get me a crash cart," she said to Chen. Not a question. Not a request. A command delivered in a voice that had last been used to call in airstrikes on a satellite phone in a place where the sun burned through the air like a hammer. Chen blinked at her. "Now," she said. He moved. Jake's eyes found hers and for a moment something flickered in them, recognition, maybe, or the ghost of it, the way you almost remember a dream after you wake. "There's..." he began, his voice breaking. "It's hard to..." "I know." She was already moving to the supply station, her hands knowing exactly where to go without her eyes directing them. Muscle memory. Classified muscle memory. Pericardial tamponade. Your surgery missed a small tear. Blood's filling the sac around your heart, crushing it. We're going to fix it. Right now. The monitor alarm shrieked at 3:15 a.m., a sound like a bird dying inside the machine. Jake's rhythm showed on the screen, organized, orderly, textbook electrical activity. But his blood pressure was 0 and his pulse was gone. Pulseless electrical activity. His heart was still firing signals to a body that had nothing left to pump. The code team was for minutes away from the trauma bay. Brooke had 45 seconds. She didn't wait for them. She didn't wait for the attending or the cardiothoracic surgeon sleeping in the call room. She grabbed a 22-gauge spinal needle from the crash cart with the same steady hand that had carried a 300-pound Special Forces operator through 4 miles of Baghdad Street with a 7.62mm round lodged under her collarbone, and she counted the landmarks, the angle of Louis, the xiphoid process, the space between the 5th and 6th ribs. Her fingers found them in the darkness the way a blind woman reads Braille. She didn't hesitate. She didn't breathe. She angled the needle beneath his xiphoid process and into the pericardial space and felt the resistance give way like a membrane breaking, and when she pulled back on the plunger she drew 60 milliliters of dark blood, the color of old wine, the color of life leaking where it shouldn't be, and the moment that blood left his chest, Jake gasped. His back arched. His hands clenched the bed rails. His eyes opened wide and locked on hers, and something in them shifted, clicked into place, like a lock finding its key. "You," he whispered. His voice was barely audible. "Baghdad. You carried me. Your name is." His pulse came back. The monitor bleeped once, twice, and then settled into a rhythm, a steady, living, beautiful, ordinary heartbeat. His blood pressure spiked from nothing to 82/58, still low but climbing, his oxygen saturation rising with each breath. The resident who'd been observing from the doorway, a small woman with her mouth open, stepped backward as if the science she'd just witnessed had physically pushed her. Her pen fell to the floor. It clattered against the tile with a sound like glass breaking. "Where did you learn that?" she stammered. "That's not, we never covered." "Textbook procedure," Brooke said flatly. She was securing the catheter with practiced efficiency, her hand steady as surgical steel. Cardiac tamponade. Needle decompression under the xiphoid process. Standard emergency medicine. She didn't look at the resident. She didn't look at Jake, though his eyes were still on her face like a man coming up from underwater and seeing daylight for the first time. She secured the line and stepped back and checked his vitals again, 88/62 now. O2 sat climbing toward 96. Pupils reactive to light. The code team burst through the doors at that moment, their crash cart thundering like horses, the attending leading them with his jaw set hard. They took in the scene in a single glance, the patient stabilized, the line placed, the blood in the syringe, the nurse standing beside the bed with her shoulders back and her composure absolute. Dr. Whitfield arrived 90 seconds later. His jaw tightened when he saw Jake alive. His eyes moved to the syringe, to Brooke, to the monitor showing normal rhythm, and something ancient and primal flickered across his face, the look of a man who had just realized he was standing in a room with a predator he couldn't see. He said nothing. He turned and walked to the hallway. Brooke followed because she had no other choice, and when they were alone in the corridor with the fluorescent lights humming overhead and the sound of the code team working in Jake's room behind them, he turned on her with his voice kept low enough that no one else could hear but loaded with the weight of a man who understood exactly what he'd just witnessed and hated her for it. "My office," he said. 1 hour. Don't touch another patient." She nodded. She didn't speak. There was nothing to say, and she had learned a long time ago that power lived in silence. He turned away from her and pulled his phone from his pocket, and she walked back to the nurse's station, and in the 3 minutes that followed, Dr. Whitfield made 4 phone calls that would reshape her remaining hours at Seattle General with the precision of a surgical strike. The first call went to the hospital board president mid-racquetball game. "We have a significant liability exposure," Whitfield said. "One of our nurses just performed an unauthorized procedure. Cardiac intervention. No physician order, no consent, no documentation. I'm concerned about her credentials." The second call reached the staffing agency that had placed her 15 months ago. By the time that call ended, Brooke's reference files had somehow become corrupted in their digital system, a minor technical glitch, they would say later, probably a server error, though later investigations would show the deletion was deliberate and professional. The third call summoned an external auditor. The fourth contacted legal. The trap closed quietly, with the efficiency of a hand folding shut. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the worst part at all. At 7:44 a.m., Brooke sat in Dr. Whitfield's office with her hands folded in her lap, her posture the careful neutrality of someone who had learned long ago that stillness was survival. The chief of medicine didn't look at her as he opened a manila folder across his desk, his fingers precisely aligned with the edge as if aesthetics mattered more than consequence. "Protocol violations," he said, his voice smooth as aged scotch. 6 weeks of documented deviations. Invasive procedure without attending supervision. Failure to follow chain of command. He slid a printout toward her, electronic records with timestamps, her name highlighted in yellow across incident reports she'd never seen before. The fluorescent ceiling panel buzzed overhead, casting everything in the pale institutional light that made liars look like saints. She scanned the fabrications without moving, her eyes tracking entries dated back to the Thursday before the code, before Jake Reeves had crashed, before she'd saved his life with muscle memory carved into her bones in a Baghdad street 6 years ago. "Your background check shows inconsistencies," Whitfield continued, leaning back in his chair with the satisfied lean of a man who believed he'd already won. "The staffing agency can't verify your references. They claim their files were corrupted, which is frankly suspicious. I've brought in an external auditor. The hospital board president agrees this pattern is untenable." He wasn't lying, not technically. She could feel the architecture of his sabotage now, the precision of a man who had built his entire career on the leverage of small truths twisted into weapons. For phone calls. That's all it had taken. The board president's racquetball game interrupted, her references scrubbed from existence, an auditor's scope expanded to include her entire hiring file. Competent. Methodical. And she understood in that moment that he'd been planning this since the grand rounds, since she'd triple-checked his equipment orders, since she'd questioned the necessity of supplies that bloated his invoices. "The pericardiocentesis you performed," Whitfield said, and there it was, the pivot to her actual sin, the moment she'd stepped outside the boundaries of invisibility. That was the final straw. "You don't have the credentials for that level of intervention, and you performed it without authorization. That's reckless. That's dangerous." He slid the termination letter across the desk with the finality of a surgeon closing a chest. 1 page. Standard template. Grounds for immediate discharge. She read it anyway, taking the full 30 seconds to absorb each sentence, her signature muscle, the one that had never trembled under fire or interrogation, now perfectly steady as she signed without reading most of it. Her hands were instruments. Her hands were steel. "Effective immediately," he said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice now, the kindness of a predator that had tasted victory. "Security will escort you out." But he didn't call security. Brooke realized this as the silence extended past the threshold of normal conversation. He was going to make her walk out alone, make her carry her shame past the nurse's station, past the resident she'd worked beside, past the OR where she'd stood trauma bay alert for 3 months. That was his real punishment. Not the termination, but the visibility of it. The public nature of her erasure. She stood without him asking her to, collected the letter and the folder of fabricated records, and turned toward the door. "Sullivan," he said, and she paused at the threshold without turning back. "Next time, stick to bedpans." The words weren't new, he'd tried this before at the vending machine and failed to break her then, but they landed differently now that she had no job, no cover, no place to stand and pretend to be just a nurse anymore. She didn't respond. She never responded. The door closed behind her with a soft hydraulic hiss. The basement laundry room at 8:45 a.m. was a concrete cathedral of loneliness. Strip lights buzzed overhead in that particular frequency that had followed her through every military installation and now, apparently, into the depths of a civilian hospital where she'd tried to disappear. The industrial washer and dryer hummed in their cycles, rhythmic, reliable, indifferent to human suffering. She'd changed into civilian clothes in the locker room upstairs, leaving her scrubs folded precisely on the bench, the hospital issuing them out again within the hour to someone else wearing her shift. Now she held the set she'd worn yesterday, the fabric still carrying the faint smell of antiseptic and her own sweat, and began the muscle memory of hospital corners, fold, tuck, the geometry of order in chaos. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that her hand started to tremble. Not visibly. Not where anyone could see the tremor that ran through her fingers like current through damaged wiring. She'd held her composure for 12 years of active duty, through 3 tours where the ground moved under her feet and voices screamed in languages she'd learned to understand, where she'd carried men twice her size through burning streets while calling in airstrikes on a satellite phone that never left her neck. She'd held it through interrogation by people who understood that silence was more powerful than screaming. She'd held it through the classified operation that had left her officially dead, erased from every database, reassigned to a life of complete invisibility where she pushed pills and checked vitals and was supposed to forget that she'd ever been Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan of SEAL Team 3. The Navy had told her never to surface. Never to use her rank. Never to let anyone know what she'd done or where she'd been. Forget the medals. Forget the citations. Forget Operation Sandviper. Become nothing. Become invisible. Become just a nurse in a city where no one knew her name. And for 18 months, she'd done it perfectly. Until she'd saved Jake Reeves' life and made the mistake of being too good at it. Now her hands trembled as she folded her scrubs with the same precision she'd used to field dress a wound, the same precision she'd used to perform a pericardiocentesis in 45 seconds. The trembling wasn't fear. Fear required the possibility of a future worth protecting. The trembling was the crack in the only structure she'd been allowed to build, the careful architecture of her invisibility coming apart in a basement laundry room under fluorescent lights that buzzed like the insects in Baghdad that had covered the body of the operator she'd carried for miles while her own shoulder bled through her uniform and she'd kept moving anyway because stopping meant death for 11 other people depending on her to make it to the extraction point. She pressed her palms flat against the folding table until the trembling stopped. 1 minute. 2. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. Somewhere above her, the hospital continued its business, patients admitted, patients discharged, patients forgotten, Dr. Whitfield preparing his next fabrication, her badge already reassigned, her ID already deactivated, her entire existence in this place revoked with the press of a button and the signature of a man who'd won because he'd been competent enough to understand what he was attacking. The trembling stopped. Brooke folded the scrubs one final time, hospital corners, perfect corners, the last act of discipline she would perform in this building, and carried them to the return bin. The folding table's metal edge was cold under her hands. Everything in the basement was cold, even the air that didn't move, even the light that came from no visible source and therefore seemed to come from everywhere at once, pressing down like the weight of 6 years of living as a ghost. She'd been told this would be her life now. Service without recognition. Heroism without acknowledgement. Invisibility as the price of existing at all. She picked up the cardboard box she'd packed that morning, coffee mug, pen set, the photo of Marcus from high school that she kept at her desk, and walked toward the basement stairs. Her son was 17 now, old enough to understand that his mother had been lying about who she was, old enough to ask questions about the shadow box she'd hidden in the attic, the one with the medals and the citations and the official paperwork declaring her dead. She'd told him never to open it. She'd told him the truth was classified and that knowing the truth would put him in danger and that some secrets were the only way to keep people you loved from being collateral damage in wars they'd never started. He'd listened. He'd obeyed. He'd waited. And she'd just lost everything protecting that same invisibility. The basement stairwell was empty. Her footsteps echoed off concrete as she climbed toward the lobby, where morning light was just beginning to filter through the atrium windows, where the hospital was settling into its daily rhythms of crisis and routine, where nobody knew that the nurse with the steady hands and the quiet presence had just been unmade by a predator in a starched coat who'd been competent enough to understand that the most dangerous enemies were the ones no one was supposed to acknowledge. The morning light filtered through the atrium windows at Seattle General as Brooke sat on the lobby bench with her cardboard box of belongings at her feet, the sum total of 18 months of careful invisibility, reduced to personal items and a stethoscope she'd never use again. Her hands rested on her lap, steady now, the trembling from the basement laundry room long since controlled. The hospital hummed around her with the ordinary sounds of Thursday morning, phones ringing at the reception desk, the distant hiss of automatic doors, the mechanical rhythm of a ventilator cycling from somewhere in the ICU. She wasn't waiting for anything. She was simply existing in the liminal space between her old life and whatever came next, a Master Chief Petty Officer disguised as a fired nurse with nowhere to go and no one to report to. Then the lobby doors burst open with a force that made 3 nurses look up from their stations. Marcus ran through the entrance carrying the shadow box she'd forbidden him to touch for 8 years, the glass-fronted case she kept locked in the attic of their rented house, the one containing medals and ribbons and photographs that belonged to someone she'd stopped being the day she'd signed the classified confidentiality agreement. Her son's face was flushed with something between excitement and panic, and he was shouting her name before he even reached her. "Mom, they need to see these. Mom, the general is here." He thrust the shadow box toward her, his voice cracking like it still did sometimes when he forgot to be careful around her fragility. But Brooke wasn't fragile. Fragile was what they'd trained out of her in Baghdad, and no amount of years as a hospital nurse could bring it back. She reached for the box instinctively, her movement controlled, but Marcus was already opening it in front of the gathering crowd, the nurses from the day shift pausing in mid-stride, the custodian with his floor buffer stopping cold, the hospital administrator emerging from his office because something in the energy of the moment had shifted. The shadow box opened like a book, and suddenly the atrium was holding its breath. Inside lay a bronze star, its ribbon faded from years of careful storage. A silver star beside it, the medal catching the fluorescent light like captured starlight. 2 purple hearts, their violet ribbons nearly black with age. And beneath them, photographs, Brooke in desert camouflage with sand-stained face paint, Brooke in a Black Hawk helicopter, Brooke with her arm around a sergeant whose name she still remembered even though she wasn't supposed to. The citations were laminated, typed on official Department of Defense letterhead, dates and operational codes and mission designations that had been classified top secret for years beyond the statute of secrecy. The Marine veteran security guard named Ramon Torres, the man who'd worked the lobby desk for 4 years and who Brooke had always nodded at during shift changes, stepped forward and went absolutely still. His posture changed in a single second, the casual slouch of a lobby guard transforming into something with the precision of a drill sergeant. His jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice cracked like it hadn't cracked in 30 years. "Master Chief Petty Officer, on deck," he said, and then he brought his hand up in a salute so crisp it sounded like a rifle shot against the hospital quiet. The general arrived 3 seconds later, though she'd actually been in the building the entire time. She'd been greeting hospital donors on the 3rd floor for the Veterans Day photo op when hospital security had called to inform her that something extraordinary was happening in the lobby. She was dressed in dress blues, 2 silver stars catching the overhead light, and she moved through the gathered staff like a ship cutting through still water. Her eyes fell on the shadow box, on the medals, on the photographs, and something ancient and knowing flickered across her face, the expression of someone who'd spent 28 years in command reading the records of people who'd survived what most people didn't survive. She read the first citation in silence, then the second. Her hand reached out and touched the bronze star with a single finger, like it was something that might burn her. Then she turned to the hospital administrator and began to speak, and when a 2-star general speaks in a voice meant to carry through a crowded lobby, everyone stops pretending to work. "Operation Sand Viper, August 2016, she said, her words landing with the weight of classified history being made declassified in real time. This officer led the extraction of 12 Special Forces operators from a hostile zone with sustained small arms fire coming from 3 directions, rotor wash from the exfil bird creating 0 visibility, 2 operators down and bleeding through their tourniquets. She carried the most critical casualty 4 miles across open terrain, with a ballistic round through her right shoulder that she didn't report until the bird was wheels up toward Bagram. She coordinated air support via secure SATCOM while performing triage, called in an Apache gunship while pressing a field dressing to her own wound. She did this for people who didn't know her name. She did this for people who didn't know she existed. 12 operators came home because of her decisions in a 4-hour window when everything was on fire and everyone was afraid. The general paused, and the silence that followed was the kind of quiet that happened when a room full of people suddenly understood they were standing next to someone they'd never deserved to underestimate. The voice was like gravel in a cement mixer, rough and authoritative and absolutely certain. "This is Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, and she is the reason Jake Reeves is alive to roll his wheelchair into this lobby right now." Jake came through the main doors in his motorized chair, moved with the practiced efficiency of someone learning his new body, and his face, the face of a man who'd been unconscious through most of the extraction, whose memories of Baghdad were fragments and morphine dreams, suddenly went absolutely white. His hand lifted instinctively to his sleeve, and he pulled the fabric up over his shoulder to show the tattoo underneath, the letters still slightly inflamed from the needlework. Brooke Sullivan. Not a name tattooed by choice or conscious memory. A name his hands had known to ink when his brain couldn't remember anything else, muscle memory of survival finding a way to mark something his conscious mind had forgotten. He rolled his wheelchair forward until it was 3 feet from where she sat, and when he spoke, his voice shook with the weight of a life that shouldn't have existed. "She was carrying me," he said to the crowd, to the general, to the hospital staff that had suddenly remembered how to breathe. "My left lung was compressed, I was going into shock, and she was moving through hostile fire like it wasn't even happening, calling in airstrikes like she was ordering coffee." For miles, he had to stop, his voice cracking like he was the one made of glass instead of her. "She saved 12 of us. And she kept going. She kept going." The general turned to Dr. Whitfield then, and her expression didn't change, it simply became the expression of someone making a decision that had already been decided by circumstances beyond his control. He was standing near the reception desk, his face cycling through emotions like a slideshow stuck on repeat, confusion, then understanding, then something that looked almost like rage before it transformed into the pale realization of a man watching his entire institutional power structure collapse in real time. The general walked toward him with the slow, inexorable movement of gravity working on falling objects. "Dr. Whitfield," she said, and each word was a sentence by itself, "you are terminated, effective immediately. You will answer to the Inspector General about your billing practices. You will cooperate fully with the external auditor now examining your department records. You will retain legal counsel." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Hospital administration, he no longer has privileges at this facility. Security, escort him from the building. Ramon Torres moved with the professionalism of someone who'd been waiting for permission, and 2 other security officers emerged from the staff corridors like they'd been positioned exactly for this moment. They approached Whitfield with the calm, practiced efficiency of men trained in how to remove someone from a space without creating a scene, and they absolutely created a scene, but it was a controlled one, choreographed like a piece of military theater. Whitfield's white coat came off as he was walked toward the exit. His staff badge was removed from his neck. His protest started soft and then escalated into something desperate and then faded into silence as he realized that every authority he'd imagined he possessed had been subordinate to authorities he'd never known existed. The local news cameras that had arrived for the Veterans Day photo op captured every frame, the perp walk through the lobby, the moment his shoe caught on the revolving door, the way his lawyer appeared from somewhere in the crowd looking confused and furious. By noon, the hospital board president would issue a statement. By evening, the investigation would expand. By the end of the week, the charges would become public record. But in that moment, the lobby was simply quiet except for the sound of his security escort and the whisper of automatic doors closing behind him. Brooke didn't move. The training had taught her not to move, not to react, not to let her face show the things happening inside her chest. Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, visible for the first time in 8 years, officially erased and suddenly restored, standing in the lobby of a hospital where she pretended to be someone small and invisible, simply watched the space where Dr. Whitfield had been until the general moved back toward her with a piece of paper in her hand. "The president wants to meet with you," the general said, handing her an official envelope with the White House seal embossed on the front. 6 weeks. Navy Cross ceremony. Your son can attend. You'll be reinstated to active status with full back pay and promotion to Senior Chief Petty Officer, effective immediately. Welcome back to official existence, Master Chief. Then she walked back to her phone call, already calling the Pentagon with updates that would ripple through classified channels for weeks. Marcus was crying, actually crying, his shoulders shaking, and Jake was staring at her with the expression of someone who'd suddenly had his entire fragmented memory reassemble itself. The cardboard box of belongings sat forgotten on the bench as Brooke stood, her uniform appearing like it had simply been waiting under the nurse's scrubs the entire time, brass and ribbons and the weight of history she'd been carrying invisibly. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave. The timid nurse was gone. "Let's go home," she said, and it wasn't a request. It was a command. 6 months later, Brooke stood on the White House lawn in dress blues that gleamed under television lights, the Navy Cross catching gold and crimson light as the president's hands moved to pin it to her chest. The citation was being read aloud: Operation Sand Viper, 12 operators extracted, for miles under fire, sustained engagement, extraordinary valor under impossible conditions. The words were being broadcast to networks and to classified channels and to military communities that had been waiting 8 years to know her name. Marcus held the pair of combat boots beside her, worn and stained with Baghdad sand and blood, now displayed in a glass case because they were artifacts now, pieces of history that had finally been allowed to exist. Jake stood in his dress uniform, the tattoo of her name visible below his rolled sleeve, and when the president shook her hand, Brooke's composure remained perfect, no trembling, no visible emotion, just the steady presence of someone who'd learned long ago that the world was watching less than she'd feared. When it was over and the cameras had gone elsewhere, Marcus asked her what she was thinking. Brooke looked at the boots in their case and remembered the basement laundry room where she'd folded her scrubs alone under fluorescent lights, where her hands had shaken for the first and only time since she'd learned how to carry other people's survival. "True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching," she said quietly. "Everything else is just evidence." If you've ever been invisible in your own life, underestimated or overlooked or told you were less than you actually were, subscribe to this channel and let us know in the comments what you're finally ready to stop hiding.